All right, the lights are on and we are back for week 2 of synchronous online instruction via YouTube Live. This is AP US Government and Politics. You know who I am, coming to you from Virginia. My name is Ms. Hitchcock. Let's look at what we're going to look at today. So our goal is we're going to be looking at topic 5.4 for those of you who are following along in the CED. Today, you're going to analyze evidence of party realignment so that you can explain how and why political parties adapt to changes in order to win elections. And you'll know you've got it when you can successfully explain a final quantitative FRQ. Yay, we're done. I'm so excited. All right, so today we'll look at the previous FRQ. We'll look at some party realignment, which some kids asked about what that was. I told them we'll get back to them. And then we'll do a guided practice. In that guided practice, we'll be looking at that multiple choice question that I fell down on last class. So our Prereqs 1.2 types of democracy. Today, we're going to be looking at limitations of visual representation of data. And we're going to want to explain how and why parties change and adapt. So welcome to Minor Factual Error Corner. Today, we're looking at Kristen, who told me that it's Hubert Humphrey, silly goose, from Minnesota. I couldn't pull it last class, and she caught me. Thank you, Kristen. We are going to take some questions from students now. So the first question is from Arav, who is from Strawberry Crest in Florida. Hello, my friend. And giving a shout out to his AP Gov teacher, Ms. Nickerson. The question is, how might coronavirus pandemic change or alter one's political beliefs and or their party affiliation? So that's a great question, going back to topic 4, unit 4, sorry. That has to do with political socialization and these things called generational events. So I would say, yeah, it certainly is going to impact the way that people understand the role of government in our private lives. We look at this generational event and how that will be read by each and every single different generation. And then you kind of have to put into that, like where they're from, political ideology, their careers, so on and so forth. I would anticipate that it definitely is going to alter people's perceptions of what they want from their government. An example that I pulled from the headlines over the weekend would be that the emergency cash payment debated in Congress over the past couple of days sound a lot like Andrew Yang's universal basic income. Now, it's not quite the same thing because we're not talking about consistent payments over the whole life. We're talking about certain classes of people who are getting a one-time payment. But I think it's interesting that we're kind of looking at those one-time payments that I don't know if I've ever heard, and I'll open it up to all of the people who are listening at home to kind of like give me some feedback. Have you ever heard of this before? To this extent, this sounds really different to me. And I think the press has been picking up on that. It's kind of a second round for Andrew Yang. So I'm really curious to see also how this is going to impact the popularity of Bernie Sanders' platform plank of Medicare for all, whether or not this is something that will become more popular over time. We'll see. All right. Mcgovern asked for the answers to C that I messed up. And so we're going to go right to that. Thank you, my friend. I wanted to give you B because remember B builds on, or C builds on B. So let's go back to what that answer was. So we had identified that a pattern between race and Hispanic origin voting rates between 2012 and 2016 decreased for Hispanics, Black non-Hispanics, and other race non-Hispanics. And that decrease was between 0.6% for 45 to 64-year-olds, and the highest was at -8%, around almost -9% for 30 to 44-year-olds who are Black non-Hispanic. So we had to come up with a conclusion, draw a conclusion that's logical, right? That's rooted in whatever that data set might be. And so since we had been talking about some of the federal legal protections for these classes of voters, language minorities and racial minorities, that would make logical conclusion or logical connection there to go back to the Voting Rights Act requirement for federal pre-clearance. So our answer here is a reason why the Hispanic Black, non-Hispanic, and other race non-Hispanic may exist, this decrease, I should say, is that the Voting Rights Act federal pre-clearance enforcement ended in 2013. Since no states are now eligible for pre-clearance, states can change voting laws that might negatively and disproportionately single out racial and language minorities voter turnout. So, all right, our guest question number 3. The question was from Lily. Can we have a different answer for our FRQ than you do, as long as we have evidence to back it up from the graph? So I want to turn to the example to give you some feedback on that one. So let's go to our warm up. This was the FRQ that I ended on last class. So if we take a look, just familiarize yourself with it. We see the 4 points. We see a relatively simple kind of graph. We look at this, it's one point in time, so it's not time series, it's cross-sectional. We're looking at slicing up different populations and their answer to a single question, which is, should government officials compromise or stick to their principles? Now, the first thing that I want to tell you, which I think is kind of fun about this, is that this comes from the American National Election Study, which is a publicly academically run data set that's frequently used by political science to research American attitudes. So if you're a teacher, I gave you this link to this super awesome article that I got from a colleague at TJ, Mr. Brian Field, who was a former student, I believe, of Grossman, who's one of the researchers here. And I'm like crazy about this research. I thought it was just so much fun to read. And I saw there's a lot of parity here with this question prompt. So the thing that Grossman and Hopkins get into is they look at ANES and they identify, amongst many other things, that Republicans are what we would call ideologue voters, where they care more deeply about ideology, and there's some really great data there from ANES to help prove that point. Whereas Democratic voters might be pretty much like what we look at as lowercase l liberal, where they believe in all those 5 things that we talked about last class that are political values. But because they have different kind of characteristics that can be ethnically based, that can be racially based, it can be based in rooted in their sex, and the whole other host of things, they kind of kick out of the Republican Party, and they maybe look to the Democrats to bring what's called group benefits, where they're looking to see policy that is helping alleviate some problem that that group is experiencing. And it's a really interesting set of research. And so when I love this because of the connection between these 2 things. So let's attempt to answer this question. The first thing here is identify the political affiliation of people who are most likely to be elected officials and should therefore compromise. Now, we want to make sure that we have symmetry in our language here. I know last class we talked about liberal Democrats. You could use liberal Democrats here, but I want you to make sure that you're picking information that comes out of the data for your answers to A and B and potentially C as well. So use similar language, because remember, it's about reading those stimulus questions and not so much about kind of looking beyond whatever that data set is. We have to be firmly rooted in what the data set before us is in A and B. We're not making any inferences at all. So the answer here is very simple. We're repeating our prompt. The political affiliation of people who are most likely to believe elected officials should compromise are Democrats, right? And so here's our flex, right? Democrats prefer compromise 66% of the time. If it's an identifier, we're just naming, but we love to make sure that we put down those insurance policies in our data sets, make sure that we kind of flex that we can read those graphs. All right, so the next question here is describe the difference between Democrats and Republicans on their attitudes of whether government officials should stick to their principles based on the data in the bar graph. So based on the data in the bar graph is a super big important thing that's telling you that you cannot, again, read outside of this bar graph. You have to use the evidence that's in front of you. And because we're describing, that means that you're going to identify what that difference is, but then you're going to describe it using quantitative data from our from our graphic here. So another thing that I really wanted to make sure that I highlighted is that you want to make sure you're answering the question that's asked. And believe it or not, one of the things that I would anticipate people getting on this is that instead of focusing on should they stick to their principles, they might flip it to talk about compromise. They might get the right values. They might show that they're understanding how to read it, but you have to answer the question. It's called ATQ. I'm sure your AP Gov teacher uses ATQ all the time. If you're not answering that question, even if you're right, no credit, friend, no credit. And that's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to read a response where we know that the student knows what they're doing, they can use the skill, but they're not answering the question. Because remember, you have to do all the heavy lifting. As a reader, we cannot make any assumptions. So the difference that we're looking for here, we see that there's a difference of 21% that's highlighted there. And let's get to our answer, repeating the prompt. Republicans are more likely to think government officials should stick to their principles than Democrats. That right there, my friend, is our identify. And now we need to step into the data. We need to get quantitative. We need to get numerical. I need to see you doing some math, friends, in order to get our describe point. So Republicans support sticking to principles 55% of the time, while Democrats support sticking to principles 34% of the time. That's a difference of 21%, right? Super easy. And at this point, going back to Lily's question, A and B, there is no reason for you to be giving any other answer other than what's here in front of us, because we're answering the question, because there's really only one answer. Like maybe you would say Republicans support it 55% of the time, period, full stop. You're still reading the, you're still being able to interface with the stimulus there, but the kind of your assertion, the first thing that's underlined up there, that's not going to change at all. That's one answer that you can give. All right. So we get to our C point, and in here we want to explain the data in the bar graph. So again, we are rooted in our data here, how that could influence how a Republican candidate would shift. So I need to see movement. That's before and after. This is cause and effect. It would shift their campaign positions after securing the Republican nomination for president. So logically connect to the stimulus, show a shift, which means I need to see a before and after, and connect it to some other part of the course. Here we're talking about elections. Lots of you have done this before. Some of you have not. I mean, it's all good. We're just reviewing, right? Okay, so here I'm looking and I'm seeing Republicans, right? What do they prefer? We know this, for people to stick to their principles. So, but these little red arrows indicate that at some point, the candidates are no longer just talking to Republicans. Remember, primaries and caucuses are intra-party contests where the party is making a decision amongst themselves who they want to kind of run the ship, right? Or to be captain the ship. As soon as we move into the general election, now we're opening the door so that everyone can participate, right? You want votes from all voters, not just the people who are your base. So that means that we would logically want to see a shift, because all of that hardcore sticking to the principles may not resonate really well with other voters that you're out there shopping for. So for that reason, a Republican candidate would stick to their principles during the primaries and caucuses, because only Republicans are involved in the phase. That's our before. Now we're repeating our prompt here. Once the Republican wins the nomination and is now campaigning for the general election, to independents and Democrats who prefer compromise, that prefer compromise part is rooted, I'm rooting it back in my data set. The Republican may start to compromise on issues to gain voters. So what we see there is now that there's this, they're starting to compromise on issues, right? They're starting to use things, and it's very clear what that Republican candidate is going to do. I know exactly what that language looks like. That would earn you the point. All right, so let's go to D. Again, explain how the data in the bar graph, that means we're rooted in our data, could affect policymaking interactions between president and Congress. Remember, now we're making some more inferences and connections here to other issues. Now, Lily, here is where you have some options, because if we're thinking about this, we're like, oh, okay, It depends on who controls the various branches, our policy-making branches, our political branches of government. A divided government exists when you have 100% cohesion in party between the presidency and both chambers of Congress, which we don't live in, right? Or we don't live in that perfectly right now. I'm sorry, I'm getting them reversed. I got ahead of myself. Party A controls the presidency. Party B controls both chambers of Congress. Read it, Ms. Hitchcock, it's right there. All right, that's divided government. Divided Congress is when Party A controls one chamber of Congress and the presidency, and Party B is in the other. That's what we have right now. And unified government is when the same party controls all three. Cool sidebar, it's called a trifecta in the state government context, but we don't use it at the national level. So you have choices. Pick one that you feel works, right? Responses rely on selecting one of these and clearly connecting it to the effect of the data, and the most important part, to the institutions named in the prompt. I need to see president, I need to see Congress, I need to see that you understand that they may not necessarily be wearing the same team colors. So policymaking is harder during times of divided governments. There, I'm naming it. For instance, here's where I'm turning into my example. Actually, I can show you, right? Repeating my prompt, clear answer, naming, taking my position. For instance, here is using evidence from the stimulus that logically supports. If Republicans control Congress and there's a Democratic president, policies proposed by the president would face two chambers of Congress that wish to stick to their principles, connecting it back to the data. While a Democratic president may be more likely to compromise, still connecting it back to the data, they would struggle to get any liberal policies past the Republican Congress, and therefore liberal policies will most likely not be passed. You know, you can throw in a couple of like grammatical problems in there too. It's all good. All right. So that is our summary, and I hope that that helped Lily answer your questions in terms of where you can deviate from the prompt, where you can get different answers. Okay, so what do parties need to do to survive? We left off talking about parties last time, and I want to connect it back to this idea of parties are the vehicles of, we're going to say, mostly pluralism. Remember we talked about pluralism last time? Remember we had our guest speaker who came in? Remember this guy? Remember him? Yeah, we hung out all weekend. We read the Constitution, wrote some letters, hung out with Dolly, all the good things. All right, so parties are the vehicles mostly of pluralism, although not always. It kind of depends on a lot of different factors, but for the most part, right? So we went and we talked last class about Madison's discussion of federalism and his use of how parties kind of like work, right, to extend that sphere, to make competition in a larger plane so that the majority has to actually compete in kind of the marketplace of ideas. And that should provide for a protection of the rights of other citizens. Recall last class that we talked about parties being loose collections or coalitions of different groups of voters who are under that big tent designation, right? They're buying into that brand name. The exact composition and their ideologies shift around on any given election around policy interests and desire to win. This is where they are roughly right now, but we could see these guys pop in and out. You know, maybe the conservative, like blue dog Democrats might pop into the Republicans for whatever reason, and that's totally fine because they're adapting in order to win votes. As policy preferences of the voting public are influenced by those generational events that happen, right? We want to make sure that you're trying to assemble the biggest team you possibly can under your tent to be able to ensure a victory. So there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in this one. We're just going to kind of slowly walk through this really quickly. The first thing we want to think about here is last time we talked about our political compass, and this is like my adaptation of it. So what's really happening here is if we have a spectrum that Americans lie on, right? What parties are doing is they're cleaving apart. We have all the best words in AP Gov, cleaving being one of them. So these groups of voters are going to be separated kind of on different issues, right? There's going to be a dividing line, and where that dividing line in shifts over time, right? It can go anywhere, it can spin in any which way. There's some people out there who feel as though this is kind of the route that we're going, more towards a huge division between more government control and less government control. But another way of looking at this, and this goes back to two of our founding fathers of political philosophy and political science, Seymour Martin Lipset and Stein Rokan, who came up with this idea that there are these dividing lines or cleavages that run through different facets. So we talk about rural, urban. That was a huge theme of the 2016 election. Owner versus worker, another big theme. Center or periphery. So we're thinking about, DC, somebody who's like all into national powers versus the powers of the states that are diffuse, and then church versus state. What we see here is that we're going to identify, parties are going to identify where these cleavages are in the American public, and they're going to kind of create a platform that is trying to pull us apart, right? Pull us into their tent so that we are forced to make this binary decision, Republican or Democrat, in terms of who's going to solve the day's problems. And our groups of voters are allowed to move back and forth between these two big tent parties, depending on the solutions offered at the table. So if we remember this, it would make sense that the party's ideology hasn't been consistent in American history, right? So how many times have we had these huge divisions or changes? Well, you may have learned about party eras in American history. In last class, I talked about V.O. Key, another political science guru, who came up with the theory of political party realignment. But if we think back to what you studied, right, there's this huge era of the Democrats from around 1800 to around 1860. And yeah, there's like some oscillation. You have the era of good feelings when there really wasn't anybody other than Monroe who was president. And, you had the American system and all those cool infrastructure developments. But then you had the rise of the Whigs, and all of these kinds of parties come and go offering issues, but for the most part, the Democrats were in control through that time period. That will change in 1860. 1860, we call it a realigning election, and I'm going to get to how we know whether or not something is a realigning election or not in a minute. But realigning elections are kind of like bolts of lightning that really drastically restructure the way that we respond and associate with the political parties that they are. Now, over time, we'll see shifts in what those political parties really mean, because every presidential candidate who walks, to the microphone is going to have a slightly different way of cobbling together policy to benefit the people in their tent. But I really like this image in my classroom. Actually, there's a replication of this that shows how parties shift over time, right? They kind of change, they'll grow into each other, grow out of each other. Even my favorite question, one of my favorite questions is, you see the evolution of the Republican Party right before the election of 1860, proceeded in the 1856 to 1860. But did you know that they're the only third party out there that's ever won a major political presidential contest? That's it. The Republicans, they were a third party. So we've had major realignments, pardon that. That's a big difference. In 1800, 1860, 1896, 1932, and 1968. We've had some small reshufflings throughout there, but our big time realignments are in those years. So that's according to V.O. Key. What are we looking for? How do we know when we're experiencing one? Number one, there's a new division in the public over ideologies, interests, and issues. Number two, it's preceded by a significant uptick in support for third parties as voters de-align or pop out of those big tent parties into new ones. Those third parties are there because they bring new ideas to the forefront that major parties cannot put on their ticket. So my favorite example is a balanced budget that comes from Ross Perot in 92 and 96. he really, really fervently believed that we needed to be fiscally conservative, and he wanted there to be this huge political effort at balancing our budget and to starting to pay down our national debt. And while it wasn't something that the Republican candidate, Bob Dole, wanted to pick up, it was something that Bill Clinton picked up. And Bill Clinton promised this in his reelection in '96. And actually, he was able to successfully pass a balanced budget amendment, or not an amendment, but a balanced budget policy, a balanced budget law with a Republican House run by a guy named Newt Gingrich. And they started paying back the national debt from '98 until 2001 is when we went back into the red. So third parties also spoil elections for ideologically similar parties. That idea that Ross Perot ran against Bob Dole, Ross Perot was relatively conservative, but he had a single issue that he really felt strongly about, and Bob Dole was not willing to pick that up, or he didn't pick it up fast enough. It got pulled into Clinton's platform. So now you have a liberal who's espousing that idea. And what ends up happening is Ross Perot is going to pull voters away from the Dole camp who don't go far enough. So these are, they spoil elections for those ideologically similar parties. They also release pressure when voters are unsatisfied with the major parties because they give us alternatives. A third component is that the turnout increases during a realigning election. Our fourth thing is it brings long spans of unified party control. And our fifth thing is it brings sharp and durable divides in our voting public. So let's look through this. I know this is a question you have. I know. A lot of you are like, was 2016 a realigning election? Well, let's look, shall we? The first thing here is that it takes time to tell. So before we get ahead of ourselves, this isn't always a retrospective assessment. And what I'm going to do right now is a back of the envelope sketch, right? I'm just kind of cherry picking data here to help me understand this. If I really wanted to prove that it was a realigning election, I would have to do hardcore political science research. But if we look at a back of the envelope sketch, we see, number one, there has to be new divisions in the voting public over ideologies, right? And was there? Yes. In particular, unions started moving towards the Republican Party in a way that they really hadn't before. This was something that the Clinton campaign was criticized for because she didn't court our traditional union states, that's Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, to the same extent that Trump did. And so that kind of new element in the Republican platform was interesting and new. We hadn't really seen that before, but we don't know if it's permanent. We really don't. So that's why we need to look and see if time will tell. All right, so in 2016, again, we're looking at a significant support of our third party as the voters de-align. And so the answer there is, I don't know, guys. I don't see a significant uptick, right? We definitely had some people going for Gary Johnson. We definitely had some people who were interested in the Green Party, so on and so forth. But Ross Perot is the most significant, and you can see there, like, do you see that nice spoiler roll there, right? Where Ross Perot kind of stole some of the voters from Bob Dole. Ross Perot had almost 20% voters of the voters who went for him. So that's a pretty phenomenal that's a pretty phenomenal result. Now, obviously, there's an uptick, but I don't know if we could call it significant. You know what we'd have to do? We'd have to wait. Only time will tell. All right, did the turnout increase? And the answer here is nah, not really. I mean, we saw 0.4% reduction between 2012 and 2016. So that's not a really great indicator. And again, we'd have to see what those trends look like over time in order for us to make any kind of extrapolation. All right, so then we have to see long spans of unified party control. Again, time will tell. Right now, we don't have unified party control for the Republicans. They lost the House in 2018 in our midterm election. But sharp and durable divides, yeah, I mean, We've got that in spades. Look at this. This is just intense. How divisive, or how deep that division is between people who are ideologically Republican and conservative Republicans and ideologically liberal Democrats. It's a pretty significant divide, thanks to the Pew Research Center. Okay. So, maybe you're like, okay, so you proved your point. Why can't we just say no, we haven't? All data sets have limitations. We look for patterns and trends, but just kind of pulling these things together, right? Going to Pew, going to the Census Bureau, going to these other resources, it's not enough for us to prove that there is a connection. And when you're looking at political science research, you are making a statistical connection. We just can say here that we see some kind of a relationship or a pattern, right? But we don't have enough information to see if those things relate to each other, if they have a causal effect, right? Just remember, just because you see a correlation in data doesn't mean that you've found the causation for those things that you're looking at. Really important. All right, so we see these patterns and trends, right? We're making an assertion based on unconnected observations. It's hard for us to prove anything. So we can only make things that are directly and logically connected. We want to make sure that we see a relationship. We'd have to do that intense research. Another way of looking at this. So over the weekend, I was just hanging outside in gray, cloudy Northern Virginia. And I made some observations over the past week and I wrote them down. I said, okay, started every day. I got up in the morning and I measured how big the leaves on the plants outside of my house were getting, right? This isn't accurate. This is just, I will say, they're not growing that much. But anyways, and then I also observed how many times there were dogs barking around my house, my two dogs that were outside. Do we see a pattern? Of course we do, right? It may not be the exact same amount, but we do see a little bit of like a general trend up until we get to day 4, and then there's a trend down, and then it's back up on 5 and 6. So maybe that means that there's some kind of association, there's some kind of relationship here, right? Wrong. We don't have enough information. We're missing data. It doesn't logically make sense that plants growing are going to make my dogs bark. They're just not that interested in plants. Now, if it's squirrels, yes, but plants, no. So maybe I need to find some other variable, some other observation, some other data points that are having a similar impact on that could explain this relationship or association. And maybe if I started paying attention to how much sunlight I have, how much like bright blue sky days I have, the hours in the day, that might make more sense in terms of explaining why the plants in my yard are growing and why the dogs are barking so much. Maybe I'm just leaving them out longer, right? So remember here, correlation does not mean that you have causation. So you need to make sure that everything has a logical connection and that you're not making inferences that exist outside of your data set, right? You can't make any leaping assumptions that open you up to too much risk. So that's our big brain moment for today, is that frequently I see in responses from students that they're just making too many leaps in their conclusions that can't be supported by the data set in front of them. And we're going to come back to that in a minute when we practice, but I do want to set the table a little bit for the Mcgovern-Fraser Commission. So the thing here is that parties, remember we talked last class about how they're decentralized, right? They do all of these crazy things to help win elections, right? And they need to adapt and adjust to make that a success. Here we're looking at decisions like we need to make sure that we're preventing this concept called front loading, where states are putting all of their primaries at the same time. Or maybe we need to change our determination on how we're going to award delegates. If you're like, I don't know what this stuff is, we'll come back to it, I promise you. We'll come back to it when we talk about elections. The other thing here that's happening at the same time, besides decentralized decisions, is we have this process of democratization happening in the election process because of this thing called the Mcgovern-Fraser Commission. Now, there's a link to a Prezi down there that has more information about the Mcgovern-Fraser Commission. It gives you some historical context, some history that you can go if you would like to know more, and also what comes out of the Mcgovern-Fraser Commission, although we're going to talk about it in a couple of different classes. But they're reforms, and they're reforms that started in the Democratic Party. It's in the election of 1968, after there are basically rioting on the streets of Chicago and fights breaking out on the floor of the Democratic Convention in Chicago. And so some of the decisions that are made, and probably the most radical of them, is that prior to 1968, no one knew who the presidential candidate was until the delegates voted at the National Nominating Convention. Can you believe that? It was a mystery. So who did you vote for? You voted for delegates, and you said to those delegates, represent my interests at that nominating convention. Well, this was at the heart of, we're talking about the big push for the civil rights movement. We're talking about a huge push for us to reconsider what's happening in Vietnam. And so all of these things are going to push the Democratic Party to think about opening this up so that it correlates more with what the voting public wants. So they're going to do a couple of things, which I'm going to speed through right now. And I promise you, we will get back to this in like 2 days. Number one, they're going to incentivize these things called primaries. It's going to diversify the Democratic Party as a result, because more of the general public is voting. They want to incentivize open primaries, which means that you don't have to register as a Democrat. They are going to allow the selections of delegates directly by the primaries. And so it's a whole crazy process that I'll talk about in 2 days. Those delegates that you've selected, they pledge allegiance to that candidate, and they will vote however the people indicated in that caucus or in the primary. They are going to expand suffrage, or I'm sorry, I should say corresponding expanding suffrage through the enforcement of the VRA, through the push for the 26th Amendment, through the 24th Amendment. Means we have voters from a diversified background who now are able to have more influence on who is being, who the candidates are. And then we're going to see the parties reduce control over that nomination through the use of delegates tied to the vote, despite inclusion of these things called superdelegates. So if I went too fast there, give me 2 days. What else? So they are also going to see it corresponds with this huge deregulation of campaign finance that we kind of got to a point in the 70s after the Nixon administration, in which money was tied down. It was tracked by the federal government through this law called the Federal Election Campaign Act. They put caps on donations from individuals. They put disclosure requirements to a new agency called the Federal Election Commission from candidates, parties, and political action committees. There was a public funding option, which means that you could donate money in your tax return, and it would go to anybody who qualified to run for national office. So these were, this was us trying to cut back on how much how much individual donors, how much unions, how much unions and corporations weren't able to directly give money since like way before that, since like the 1910s. But it's cutting back on how much influence individuals or big corporations, people with a lot of clout had, right? We are going to come back through in 2002 with the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, sometimes called, oh my God, now of course I can't think of it. It'll come to me. Just give me a second. And I'm sure like every AP government teacher is screaming at me right now, and you're all texting. It's fine. I'll get back to it. But it's going to put a limit on soft money at the national level. And what is soft money? Soft money is it's money that's spent by the party, right? So if you're at the national party level, you cannot spend money on national races, on local races, et cetera, et cetera. It's only state and local level parties, and it's McCain-Feingold. There you go. Boom, done. All right. So in 2010, we had this case. It's one of the required cases. I'm going to talk about it a little bit today for like a minute, and then I'm going to move on, where the Federal Election Commission, where corporations were now allowed to spend unlimited amounts of money. And we have a fun name for it called super PACs. Now that corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money, they're going to do that through this thing called 501c4s. That's the dark money thing. They don't have to tell you where that money came from. And then 501c4s can give money to these things called super PACs, which is like a shadow campaign. As long as you're not coordinating with the candidate of choice, you can do whatever you want. So that's really messy. I'll flesh it out for you in 2 classes, right? Parties need to craft messaging. Parties need to have more channels to message through. We talked about this, right? And an unintended consequence of all of this is that we've opened the door so that candidates have more of an ability to be able to circumvent what the party is concerned about, right? They are not as tied to a platform that does well for somebody running for the Senate in Wyoming versus someone running for the House in Florida versus someone running for the House in Vermont, right? They can untether themselves from those concerns, right? And so the candidate-centered campaign, we're gonna tease this out in a couple of different classes, in a couple different ways. But in addition to that, they have advances in communication technology that makes it super cheap. We have the rise of this field of study called political psychology. We have big data, access to super donors, dark money, and increased democratization means that you can curate hand-tailored messages for very small segments of the population who may be likely to vote for you, but you just need to tip them over. We're not worried about our base. We're not worried about those who aren't going to vote for us. It just comes down to a numbers game. Okay, so I got 5 minutes left and I've got to roll through this. This is our question that came from last class. And I'm just going to kind of touch on this. The reason why these things didn't add up is because we have ethnicity and nationality. Remember last class I talked to you about ethnicity and nationality not being the same thing. Sometimes the Census Bureau measures them separately, sometimes they're together. So if we keep that in mind that this isn't going to add up, and that's perfectly fine, we can see that that this is not going to help us speak to party positions, right? That is outside of the data set. We can't, there's no direct association between this. We'd have to have multiple sources to support that assertion. So it's not A. B, the next one, or I'm sorry, C, political parties adapting by switching. We don't have enough information, actually it's D, to know if there is a preference for representational versus or proportional versus winner take all. We have no idea. Another data set is required. So it's also kind of illogical to believe that Republicans would like that because they not only have more ideological consensus, but they're overwhelmingly preferred by white voters. We established that a couple of classes ago. So it's not D. C, we have a hard time with this because we can't tell if they're going to move to a candidate-centered campaign. Again, it's outside of this data set. So the only thing that we can say that's truly fully supported by this data set is B, that parties are going to adapt positions to find ways to appeal to voters. I know that feels like low-hanging fruit, but you often can't get a ton out of a single piece of data. So slow your roll, all right? Checking for understanding, critical elections in the United States typically have occurred. A, as a result of a temporary shift in the popular coalition supporting one or both parties. B, whenever a third party has secured more than 15% of the presidential vote. C, each time a Republican has been elected for president. D, when voter turnout has declined significantly. Or E, when groups of voters changed their traditional patterns. Give you a second. Just a second. Okay, it's E, right? That is, that's getting back to our definition. Here, the graphic illustrates which of the following statements about political parties, and I'm going to rush, so I'm sorry, my friends. A, that federalism leads to a multi-party state in which 3 parties generally compete for control. I don't see much in there about whether or not there's competition for control at state, local, et cetera, et cetera. There's some, right? But is it federalism? Is it connected to federalism? I don't know if it's really inside here. B, the founders refused to join political parties because they agreed parties were contrary to public interest. C, there's an ongoing debate between political parties over the power and scope of the federal government. especially economic and demographic stuff. And then D, Constitution settled the debate over the power of the federal government. I see nothing about the Constitution there. So the answer there is C. Sorry, I'm rushing. I know. Okay, so how did we do? How did we do? Do you got the evidence of party realignment? Can you explain how parties adapt to changes in order to win elections? And if you're up for it, you are going to prove that you can do it by taking a crack at this FRQ. So much fun. The PowerPoint I will put in the links below. I forgot to do that before we started, but I'll do it as soon as we end. So you can use that to help you get this stuff taken care of. Once again, and I'm sorry I'm rushing, but if you have an issue with technology, please let us know. We want to help you do the best you possibly can. Use cb.org/tech to help you figure that out. And I'm going to say once again, thank you so much for watching, friends. I'm so excited that we're getting through this content and we're going to be super successful on the AP exam. So I'll see you again here tomorrow at 3 o'clock. And there's my resources. And I'm going to say bye-bye.